come to you before long. But in case I am delayed, I write so that you will know how one ought to conduct himself in the household of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and the support of the truth. By common confession, great is the mystery of godliness. He who was revealed in the flesh was vindicated in the spirit, seen by angels, proclaimed among the nations, believed on in the world, taken up in glory.
Thank you, Jeremiah. I appreciate that. I had asked Jeremiah to read that passage there because we're going to get to that here in my lesson this morning. I want to tell everybody I appreciate everyone being here. It's definitely encouragement to see such a good group here this morning. We have visitors, and we definitely welcome you, and we invite you back at every opportunity that you have. And it is definitely an encouragement to me because I don't have an opportunity to do this all the time. For those who may not know, we do not have a permanent preacher at this point, but that's one of our goals. So the men of the congregation, the men of the congregation take turns in providing lessons and preaching sermons, and we have a talented group here, and we are definitely blessed. For those who may not know, upcoming this next quarter, starting September the 4th, I will be starting a series of lessons on Wednesday night regarding citizens of the kingdom. And I appreciate Joe talking this morning about that. During his lesson, I would hear things come up. I'm like, hey, I'm talking about that. So I appreciate the reference to that, and he had no idea what I was talking about, so what I was going to be discussing. But the purpose of this lesson this morning, it kind of is an introduction to an introduction. So Wednesday, starting the 4th, I will have an introduction to what is the kingdom, what is God's kingdom, and what does it take to be a citizen of God's kingdom. And so this lesson may be somewhat short this morning because I've got a lot of information that I want to get to during those weeks of those lessons. So we're just going to kind of skim the surface this morning. And then on Wednesday night, I invite you back to come listen to that. It's going to be an in-depth study of what we as Christians, what we as God's people need to be, who we need to be, why we need to be, and what qualifies us to be citizens of the kingdom. So I invite you, starting not this next Wednesday is singing night, the following Wednesday we will start those lessons. Now, for any student of the Scriptures, as you're studying the Old Testament and the New Testament, there is a clear shift. And as we move from the Old Testament to the New Testament, you can see this shift from a physical nature of the Israelites. They had physical laws. They had certain things that they had to do, certain things they had to wear, certain things that they had to do to be a citizen of God's kingdom. But then as we get into the New Testament, we see there is that shift from physical, doing these things, having to fulfill this law, this very strict Levitical law, to more of a spiritual standpoint and how we interact within this kingdom. But even with this shift, there's core principles that remain the same throughout the entire Scripture. In fact, when we reflect on the Old Testament, it often amplifies our understanding of God, His character, who He is, what His will is, how He thinks, how He wants us to be, and what our relationship with Him is all about. You know, if we look back all the way to the beginning, to the story of creation, it is clear that God had a deep desire not only to create man, but also to provide for His creation, to guide him, to be one with Him. God always wanted a close relationship with man. Think about it. When God placed man in the Garden of Eden, He didn't just put them there and leave them to fend for themselves. God was there. He provided everything they needed. He walked with them. He gave them guidance. He gave them instruction. He was there with them in the garden, providing everything they needed. And he walked with Adam in the garden. It was a very personable and personal relationship. But unfortunately, we should all know the story of what happened. Sin entered into the picture. Man did what he wanted to do. Man's disobedience led to a separation from God. It was a kind of isolation that created the need for reconciliation. Without sin entering into the world, we would still be joined with God in a personal way. That's, in my belief, I think that's what would happen. We would still be in that garden situation, in that paradise where he provided everything. But despite this, despite sin entering into the world, God's desire to live with man and to have a relationship with them never wavered. And in fact, the entire story of the salvation, from the sending his Son, his crucifixion, and his resurrection, all tells a story of how God wants to dwell with us. Even in the name of Jesus that was given, Emmanuel, God with us. God always had that desire to be with his people and for his people to dwell in him. And so when we look back at the Old Testament and we see this desire in action, we see it through the way that, even in the Ten Commandments, have no other God but me, to worship him. And so it was all about relationship between God and his people. But one of the clearest examples of this wanting to dwell with his people, is his people wanting to dwell with him, is the tabernacle in the wilderness. Think about it. Everything about the tabernacle, as they were traveling through the wilderness within these 40 years, everything that had to do with that tabernacle, from building it, from the things that went into it, to the things that were the methods of worship, it was all about God dwelling with his people. Even the word tabernacle means dwelling place. But this wasn't a dwelling place for men. It was a dwelling place for God among his people. The tabernacle, from its humble beginnings, from its tent structure in the wilderness, to its eventual transition to the temple on Zion in Israel, and then moving to the New Testament, for the temple of God being in our heart, is the spiritual dwelling place of God. God always reveals that he wants to be with us, that he wants to dwell with us, in our hearts, in our minds, and in our souls. It was a place for God to dwell among his people and for them to realize that. God always has a deep desire to be with his people. So what does that mean? What does it mean for God to dwell with us? So I want everybody to turn over to Psalms 15. And we're going to be looking at Psalms 15, and that's where the majority of our lesson is going to be coming from this morning. And it's a very short chapter. It's only 5 verses. But I want to take a look at Psalms 15, and it's written by David probably during the time or when they were building the temple in Israel. And it begins with a question in the first verse, and then spends the next 4 verses answering that. And so but when you look at these verses, I'm going to be giving a lesson, and I'm going to have 10 lessons on what it means to be a citizen, how to be a citizen. But David summarizes it here in these 4 verses, almost where I may not even need to do the lesson. So, but we're going to do it anyway. So, because if we're going to get really deep into it, but let's read Psalms 15. And the title and the question, going into this, it says, "Who shall dwell in your holy hill?" A psalm of David. "O Lord, who shall sojourn in your tent? Who shall dwell on your holy hill?" There's the question. And then the next 4 verses, he goes into the answers. And we're going to look at these on an individual basis here this morning. He who walks blamelessly and does what is right and speaks truth in his heart, who does not slander with his tongue and does no evil to his neighbor, nor takes up a reproach against his friend, and whose eyes a vile person is despised, but who honors those who fear the Lord, who swears to his own hurt and does not change, who does not put out his money at interest and does not take a bribe against the innocent. And then he sums up that person. He who does these things shall not be moved. So the question is, Lord, who may abide in your tabernacle? Who may dwell in your holy city? You know, the word abide suggests kind of a temporary stay. And where it says here, abide, it says, I got the ESV, and it uses sojourn. And a lot of times the term sojourn is talking about a traveler, someone who is moving across, staying temporarily. So the word abide is used also in other versions, suggests a temporary stay, while dwell implies permanence. It is like asking, who is fit to be a guest in God's house, or who is fit to stay here? You know, think about it. If you in your own household, you have rules. You have ground rules set, and so you're just not going to let anybody come live with you unless they follow your rules, unless they follow your standard. Because you have certain standards, because the behavior of those who stay in your house is going to reflect on you. Just like with kids, you know, you always have, you know, your kids are sometimes a reflection of who you are, even though that may not be, but people look at the behavior of their kids. Oh, they're great kids. Oh man, they need some work. You know, they don't always blame the kids. They blame the parents. Well, here there's certain rules when you live in a house. So there is also a question of citizenship, and that's one of the things that we're going to talk about in my lessons on Wednesday. Who gets to be a citizen in God's land? You know, just like the government requires people to accept certain responsibilities before gaining citizenship, God has standards for who will dwell on His holy hill and claim the rights to citizenship. Because we have certain rights of being a citizen of God, of being a citizen of the kingdom, but we also have responsibilities. But here's the key. The question is really not about relationship, not a physical dwelling place. God dwells among His people through His Spirit in the body of the church, as Jeremiah read in 1 Timothy 3:15. It says, I write so that you may know how you ought to conduct yourself in the house of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and ground of the truth. And in Ephesians 2:19 it adds, you are no longer strangers or foreigners, but fellow citizens in the saints and members of the household of God. So as Christians, as followers of God, we are citizens. We're no longer strangers to this kingdom. We're no longer strangers to God. We are one with Him. But that's not the end of it. So what does it look like to be a part of God's household? What are the characteristics of the people of God? And what does God require of His citizens? So that's what I want to look at this morning. And we're going to break this psalm down and look at what David is saying, who these people are that are citizens. So Psalms 15:2, it says, he who walks uprightly and works righteousness and speaks the truth in his heart. That's from the New King James Version. Where ESV says blameless and does what is right. So we are to walk blamelessly or uprightly. So let's look at that. What is walking uprightly? This person who walks uprightly is a person that has integrity and honesty. Their motives are pure with no hidden agendas. If anybody knows about the pulpit commentary, you know, it's And you have to be careful with commentaries. But one of the things that it describes is a person as having an absolutely incorruptible aim at the glory of God. They are blameless. So when we are walking uprightly, when we're blameless, we have to have motives. We have to have something that is driving us to do these things. But our main aim through this entire lesson is not for ourselves, but to glorify God. You turn over to 1 Peter. Keep your hand on Psalms, but turn over to 1 Peter. In 1 Peter 2, 11 through 12, and Peter's writing, he says, we're urged to live honorably among others, so that even when people speak against us, they will be won over by our good deeds. Let's read 1 Peter 2, 11 and 12. It says, Beloved, I urge you as sojourners, there's that word again, as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh which wage war against your soul. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds, and what happens? They glorify God on the day of visitation. Let there be no question in your enemies or in anybody that you are living for God, that you are a citizen. Because people in the world that are not citizens of the kingdom, they see what you're doing. And it's amazing how quickly when they see something that you do that may not be of the will of God, may be hypocritical, how quickly they can turn on you. Because they hold you as a citizen of the kingdom as with a higher standard. Second, working righteousness. You walk uprightly, blameless. Working righteousness means conforming to God's standard. It is not just about saying the right things, but about doing the will of God. It emphasizes Matthew 7:21 when it states, Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. So we can't be doing these things just in the open. We have to be doing the will of our Father at all times, no matter who is watching. So we have to be blameless. We have to be working righteousness. And third, speaking truth from the heart. This person that David is describing, his truthfulness isn't just about their words, but it's about their conscience and their conduct. They are sincere, not hypocritical. And Jesus taught in Matthew 15, 16, 20, that what comes out of the heart is what defiles a person, not just what they say. So another way of saying that is what comes out of a person's heart defines a person. So what we say, or what our heart causes us to say, or what our heart causes us to do, that's going to define us. Not only for people watching us, seeing us, but it's going to define us before God. So we have to have character. We have to have this character of walking uprightly, working in righteousness, and speaking the truth. Second, how do we treat other people? Not just other Christians, but other people in the world. In verse 3 it says, He who does not slander with his tongue, nor does evil to his neighbor, nor does he take up a reproach against his friend. We have to be kind. We have to be considerate of others. We can't speak against others. No, in James 3, 1 through 12, he really goes into a discussion about the tongue and how poisonous it can be and how damaging it can be. And the tongue can, yes, the tongue is guided by the heart and the mind, but sometimes that tongue acts before we think. James tells us that the person who can control their tongue has mastered a very difficult battle. And but it's easy to avoid physical confrontation. But how often do we harm others by our words? Not even thinking about it. It may not even have bad motives, But sometimes we can say things that can be either taken wrong or misinterpreted, or maybe we are just wrong. So we have to be careful about that. So a citizen of the kingdom has to guard their tongue. God's people should be known for their kindness and for refusing to participate in gossip or slander. Me and Julie know this person who I think their biggest enjoyment in his life is to causing issues, is to causing problems through gossip and slander. And when that gossip and slander has a negative reaction to whoever they're talking to, this person gets joy out of it. And that is the complete opposite of where we need to be. But as I said in the last section here, refusing to participate. Now, in order to participate, yes, you can be the one gossiping or slandering, but there's also someone who's listening. So the citizens of the kingdom have to control what they're hearing. If you are talking to someone and they're slandering somebody or gossiping about something, what is your reaction as a Christian? Do you listen to them? Do you react to them? Do you go, oh, well, we got to, what's up with this other person? Or do we run away from it? Do we confront it? Do we stop it? So participation is for both sides. Speaking evil and hearing evil and reacting to it. So we have to guard our tongue and control what we hear. So we have our character, who we are. We have kindness, how we act among others and how we act towards others. And number 3, what makes us do what we do? What makes us kind? What makes our character? And that is our conviction. If we look at Psalms 15, 4 and 5, it says, "In whose eyes a vile person is despised, but he honors those who fear the Lord. He who swears on his own hurt and does not change, he who does not put out his money at usury, or does he take bribes against the innocent. We have to have conviction to do that. As a human being, it's easy to take advantage of people if our character is not right. It's easy to not honor people who love God if our motives are not right. So, despising wicked. It talks about despising, in whose eyes a vile person is despised. Now, God's not telling us to hate these people. It's important to clarify that God does not sanction hatred towards other people. What the psalmist is getting at here is a strong attitude against sin. A citizen of Zion despises wickedness. In Psalms 119:53 it says, "Indignation has taken hold of me because of the wicked who forsake your law." Christians must be willing to stand up against sin and honor righteousness. In 1 Corinthians 15:33, Paul warns, "Do not be deceived. Evil companionship corrupt good morals." So we have to despise, maybe not the person, but the actions that they are, their sinful nature. That's what we are to despise. And then it states to honor those who fear the Lord and who swears to his own hurt and does not change. That's kind of a more difficult thing to talk about, but I believe that that's talking about keeping promises. Even though they may hurt. The Christian doesn't change their conviction. Promises even when it brings them pain. And Jesus emphasized this in Matthew 5:37, urging us to let our yes be yes and our no's be no. If we say something, if we promise something, I don't know, some of you may know I'm trying to start a business, and I'm very customer oriented. And if I tell the customer I am going to do something, till midnight or later to get that done. And that's well, if I say I'm going to do something, I'm going to do it. Now, if a circumstance comes along where that's impossible, I'm going to go to that person and say, hey, here's what's going on. What can we do to biblical principles? And then fairness in dealing with other people, not just Christians, but other people, where it says, does not put his own money in usury, or he does not take bribes against the innocent. Of others. In fact, they are willing to suffer wrong rather than harm their relationship with a brother or sister. 1 Corinthians 6, and I'll read 7 and 8. 1 Corinthians 6, 7 and 8. So it says to have a lawsuit at all disputes. To have a lawsuit at all for wrong, why not rather be defrauded, but you yourself wrong and defraud? There's better ways. And as Christians, we should, for both parties in that situation, should be looking for that mutual not happy. But that's not always going to happen. And that's why it says, better to be defrauded and then forgive your brother. Feelings. So we have to have good character. We have to be together. That's the glue that holds that together, is that our conviction. So David ends, will never be shaken. So let's look back at that. He who does these things, the conviction to glorify God in all he, that promise, because that's a promise. That's a conviction. That I'm going to do your will. That your path. Yes, and James warns us, when you don't have those convictions, your mind is resistant. You're going to say, oh, I'm going to change my. At him, and he's talking about prayer. Doubting for the lost by the wind, for that person must not suppose unstable. We're going to have the right character. We're not going to have the to be qualified. Those who trust in God, with God's power and the. If you truly know where in a good light. This was short and sweet, and we actually went over. What is the state of your citizen? Requirements that are so beautiful. What is the state of your character? About your words. Act with. Is it? Are you a citizen of Zion? Desire to dwell with God is. Do we want that relationship with God? Do you understand? He can do that. Citizenship. Through the blood of the weight of that more in our Wednesday night class. A citizen of spiritual what God has put means to understand only through the blood of Christ can Christ of citizenship. Stayed in here. And he gives throughout Scripture.